Hello, lovely souls, and welcome to Emily Whispers. I'm Emily, and I'm so happy you decided to join me tonight. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment and say hello. I love connecting with each of you. If these little moments bring you peace, please like and subscribe so we can share more of them together. Now find your cozy spot. Wrap yourself in a blanket if you like. Take a slow, gentle breath, and let's drift into tonight's story. Emily Vance was the kind of person who needed silence to untangle her thoughts, which is exactly why she chose the most remote trail in Shenandoah National Park for her 3-day solo hiking trip. She had been dreaming of this escape for months, desperate to get away from the sterile routine of her graphic design job and the quiet, heavy tension in her marriage to Mark when she tested him by bringing up a fake memory about their first date. He agreed with a warm smile and added details that, what she did not know, was that something had been watching the trail for weeks, studying the hikers who wandered too deep into the ancient woods, learning their rhythms, their mannerisms, their faces. Emily's mistake was not going alone. It was being the perfect template for something that had been waiting for centuries for the right person to copy on, or so convincing. She almost believed the false memory. Herself, the most chilling moment came when Emily found Liam standing on their back her second night, camped near a roaring waterfall. Emily heard a strange sound at exactly 2:43 in the morning. Deck at 2 in the morning, perfectly still, staring out at the dark woods that bordered their property. When she approached him, he did not startle or seem surprised. Instead, he turned to her with eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight, like an animal's, not the clumsy rustle of a bear or the frantic scurrying of a raccoon, but the soft, deliberate sound of someone, and said in a voice that was perfectly Liam's, but somehow hollow, "I was just thinking about how much better everything walking in the dry leaves, matching her own gait perfectly, when she finally built up the nerve to unzip her tent and shine is now. Do not you think everything is so much better now, Emily?" The way he said her name, like he her headlamp into the darkness. She saw nothing but the beam of light getting swallowed by the thick mountain fog. What was tasting a new word made her blood run cold. Emily's world fell apart completely when she received a she did not see was her own face peering back at her from behind a large poplar tree, studying every line of her expression call from the New York State Police. They had found a hiker matching her husband's description, barely alive, tied to a tree, memorizing the exact way her shoulders tensed when she was afraid the next morning. Emily packed her things with rope made from twisted roots, about 15 miles from where Liam had been camping. The man was severely dehydrated, suffering with unsteady hands, deciding to cut her trip short by a full day. As she hurried down the mountain path, she from exposure, and kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "He is in my house. He is living my life. He could not shake the feeling that she was being followed. She kept it just out of her line of sight, but it was close enough that she could hear a faint rustling in the woods that seemed to keep perfect time with her own footsteps. Is in my house when Emily arrived at the hospital and saw the man in the bed. She felt her knees. Every time she stopped to listen, the sound stopped too. Every time she spun around, she saw nothing but the empty buckle. It was Liam, unmistakably Liam, but he looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. The real Liam's story came out in broken pieces over several days of interviews with doctors and investigators. He remembered waking up on trail, winding behind her, but something was learning her, mimicking her, becoming her with every step she took toward Homemark, his 5th morning of camping, to find himself tied to a tree, watching as something that wore his exact face finished packing his gear. Vance was weeding the garden in their backyard when his wife returned from her hiking trip. And something about her arrival filled him with a strange the creature had spent hours studying him, touching his face, his hands, his hair, as if it were memorizing the texture sense of relief mixed with a deep unease. Emily walked through the back gate with a confidence he had not seen in years of his life. It had spoken to him in his own voice, asking questions about his life, his relationships, his memories. A bright, genuine smile on her face. She kissed him with a passion that had been missing for months, complimented while he watched in horror as it perfected its performance for weeks. The real Liam had been forced to watch through the flowers he had just planted and asked about his day with a sincere interest that felt foreign. For the first hour, some impossible connection as the creature lived his life better than he ever had. He could see through its eyes as it repaired Mark, felt like he had gotten his wife back from the quiet, distant place their marriage had drifted to, but then he noticed the small things, the details that were not quite right. Emily had always despised mushrooms, but she was adding them his marriage, excelled at his job, and became the version of himself that everyone seemed to prefer. The most devastating part was not the physical imprisonment, but watching his wife fall in love with a perfect version of him, while he slowly wasted away in the wilderness to the grocery list for dinner. She laughed at his joke about their town's ongoing debate about a new highway bypass, forgotten and replaced by something that understood human desire better than humans themselves when Emily returned home with the truth. But the real Emily, had been fiercely against it and usually argued with him about it. When he mentioned their summer vacation plans, she found the creature that had been living as her husband calmly reading a bedtime story to their children, as if nothing had changed. When she confronted it with what she had learned, it did not deny anything or try to continue the lie. Instead, it looked agreed with an excitement that was jarring, since the real Emily had been dreading the expense and stress of a long trip, most disturbing at her with Liam's face, and said, "But I love you more than he ever did. I have made you happier of all," when their golden retriever, Buddy, ran up to greet her. The dog's fur stood on end than he ever could. "I everything he was not strong enough to be for you. Is that not what you wanted? And it let out a low growl before running to hide under the deck. Something Buddy had never done to Emily in the 7 years they had owned him that night. Mark lay awake watching his wife sleep, studying her face in the moonlight that the terrible truth in those words made Emily realize that part of her did not want her real husband back. The creature continued, its voice taking on a pleading quality that was perfectly, heartbreakingly Liam's. He was going to leave you, Emily, streamed through their bedroom window. Everything looked exactly right. Every freckle, every line, even the tiny scar above her right. I found that in his thoughts. He was planning to quit his job and risk everything on a solo project he never even eyebrow from a childhood fall. But her breathing was too perfect, too rhythmic, like someone who was consciously remembering to breathe, rather told you about. He found his life with you suffocating, a trap. But I find it beautiful. I find you then doing it instinctively, when he whispered her name softly, just to see if she was really asleep. Her eyes snapped open, instantly fascinating. I choose to be here with you every moment, while he chose to run away to the mountains, to think about how, with an alertness that seemed almost predatory, before quickly softening into a sleepy confusion over the next few weeks. Mark watched much. He wanted to escape his life with you, Emily, stood in her home, looking at 2 versions of her husband, and in a state of bewildered joy as his marriage transformed into something he had never thought possible. Emily started cooking his favorite meals. Every realized that the creature was right about everything. The Liam in the hospital was the man who had grown distant, who had night, remembering exactly how he liked his coffee and showing a deep interest in the woodworking projects that had always bored her, stopped trying, who had been planning to risk their family's future on a secret, selfish dream. The Liam standing she laughed at all his stories, initiated affection, and seemed to possess a genuine happiness that made their previous life together seem like before her was everything she had ever wanted her husband to be. The choice should have been clear, should have been easy, a gray, faded photograph. Their friends noticed the change too, commenting on how happy Emily seemed, how much more engaged. But as she looked into those familiar eyes that were not quite right, Emily understood that love and horror could live in the same heart she was, how their relationship seemed to have been completely renewed, but Mark's growing happiness was poisoned by a creeping. And sometimes the monster gives you exactly what you thought you wanted. The official report stated that Liam Miller had suffered a psychological horror that he could not ignore. Emily's improvements were not random. They were precise, targeting every complaint he had ever privately break during his solo hiking trip, creating an elaborate delusion about being replaced by a shapeshifter. To cope with his held about their relationship with an unsettling accuracy, she seemed to know things about his childhood he had never shared with her, and she guilt about his secret plans. The man found in the forest was treated for exposure and dehydration, then transferred to a psychiatric facility, could anticipate his needs before he even realized them himself. When he tested her by bringing up a fake memory about a funny incident, when he continued to insist that someone else was living his life. His wife, Emily, visited twice before stopping altogether, unable to reconcile the broken, paranoid man in the hospital bed with the loving husband waiting for her at home, the Liam who lived on their first date. She agreed with a laugh and added details that were so convincing. He almost started to believe the false memory was real. The most chilling moment came when Mark found Emily standing in their kitchen at 2 in the morning. In the Miller house continued to be everything Emily had ever wanted. He got a major promotion at work, reconnected with friends perfectly still, staring out the window toward the Blue Ridge Mountains where she had gone hiking. When he approached her, she did not seem the original Liam had pushed away, and even managed to repair Emily's relationship with her estranged father. Their marriage became startled or surprised. Instead, she turned to him with eyes that seemed to reflect the moonlight like an animal's, and said, in the envy of their social circle, "A perfect example of love rebuilt and commitment rewarded, but sometimes late at night, Emily, a voice that was perfectly Emily's, but somehow hollow. I was just thinking about how much better everything is now." Dew would catch her husband standing motionless at the window, staring toward the distant mountains with an expression that was not quite human. "Not you think everything is so much better now, Mark." The way she said his name, like she was tasting. And she would remember that the man she loved more than she had ever loved anyone was not really a man at all. New word made his blood run cold. Mark's world fell apart completely when he got a call from the most terrifying part of Liam's story is not that something stole his identity and replaced him. It is that the replacement Virginia State Police. They had found a hiker matching his wife's description, barely alive, tied to a tree, which was so much better at being him that no one wanted the original back. In a world where we are all trying to become thick, twisted vines about 15 miles from where Emily had been camping. The woman was severely dehydrated, suffering from hypothermia, better versions of ourselves. What happens when something else achieves that perfection for us? The creature that took Liam's place did not just, and kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "She is in my house. She is living my life. She steal his life." It improved it beyond recognition, leaving behind a question that will haunt you long after this story ends. If is in my house. When Mark arrived at the hospital and saw the woman in the bed, he felt his legs start to give way. It was Emily, unmistakably Emily, but she looked as if she had aged 10 years in just 3 weeks. The real Emily's story came out in broken pieces over several days of interviews with doctors and investigators. She remembered waking up on her 3rd morning of the trip to find herself tied to a tree, watching as something that wore her exact face methodically packed up her camping gear. The creature had spent hours just looking at her, touching her face, her hair, her hands, like it was memorizing the very texture of her skin. It had spoken to her in her own voice, asking questions about her life, her memories, her relationships, while she watched in silent horror as it perfected its imitation for weeks. The real Emily had been forced to watch through some impossible mental connection as the creature lived her life better than she ever had. She could see through its eyes as it repaired her marriage, excelled at her job, and became the version of herself that everyone, including Mark, seemed to prefer. The most devastating part was not being tied to a tree, but watching her husband fall in love with a perfect version of her, while she slowly wasted away in the wilderness, forgotten and replaced by something that understood human desire better than any human when Mark returned home with the truth. He found the creature that had been living as his wife, calmly preparing dinner, as if nothing was wrong. When he confronted it, it did not deny anything or try to continue the lie. Instead, it looked at him with Emily's face and said, "But I love you more than she ever did. I have made you happier than she ever could. I have become everything she was too tired to be for you. Is that not what you wanted?" The terrible truth in those words made Mark realize that a part of him did not want his real wife back. The creature continued, its voice taking on a pleading quality that was so perfectly, heartbreakingly Emily's. "She was going to leave you, Mark. I found that in her thoughts. Someone could replace you with a better version of yourself, with the people who love you even want the real you back." The Harris family had been planning their Green Mountain National Forest camping trip for over a year. A final chance to connect before their eldest child left for college. A desperate attempt to bridge the growing distance that modern life creates between people who sleep under the same roof but live in separate worlds. David Harris, a history professor consumed by his tenure review. His wife, Sarah, a real estate agent stressed by a failing market. 17-year-old Chloe, who communicated mostly through terse texts and closed doors. And 11-year-old Ben, who was terrified that his sister's departure would be the final thread that unraveled their family. None of them realized that their choice to take separate day hikes on their third day would be the last decision they would ever make as a true family. David decided to tackle a steep, rocky summit alone. He needed time to think about the lukewarm feedback on his latest publication, a paper that could make or break his career. About 3 miles from the campsite, he encountered another hiker who looked exactly like him, down to the same worn-out hiking boots, the same university sweatshirt, and even the same nervous habit of running a hand through his hair when stressed. The other, David, smiled with a calm confidence that the real David had not felt in years, and said, "I think it is time for a new perspective." Before David could even process the words, he felt a strange, numbing sensation in his neck, and the world went dark. When he woke up hours later, he was underground in what seemed to be a natural cave, bound with thick vines that felt strangely alive and seemed to tighten whenever he struggled. Sarah had chosen the gentler lake loop, hoping the quiet beauty of the water would would soothe her anxiety about their finances and her growing fear that their marriage was becoming a business arrangement. She was taking a picture of the sun reflecting on the water when she heard someone walking up behind her. When she turned, she saw herself approaching. But this version of Sarah stood taller, smiled without effort, and radiated a kind of inner peace that the real Sarah had lost somewhere between her career ambitions and her family's needs. The copy spoke in Sarah's own voice, but with an assurance she had never possessed, saying, "You have been carrying so much. Let me help you with the weight." The last thing Sarah remembered before everything faded was an overwhelming sense of relief that someone else was finally going to take charge. Chloe had stormed off on the winding forest trail after another tense breakfast conversation about college applications and her uncertain future, a future she could not even picture because she was so lost in her present. She was sitting on a fallen log, scrolling angrily through her phone when another version of herself emerged from the trees. This Chloe was everything the real one wished she could be. Self-assured, calm, at peace with herself and the world around her. The copy sat down beside her and said, "I know how hard it is to be you. I know how tiring it is to feel so misunderstood when all you really want is for someone to see you." Chloe felt herself relax for the first time in what felt like years, just before the world went dark, and she woke up in an underground chamber where the smooth walls seemed to pulse with a faint, warm light. Ben had been exploring a small creek bed, collecting smooth, flat stones, and pretending he was an adventurer charting a new river, when he met another boy who looked exactly like him, but seemed older, wiser, less afraid of the world that so often terrified the real Ben. The copy Ben knew all about his secret fears, his anxiety about his sister leaving, and his quiet worry that his parents' sadness was somehow his fault. When the copy promised him that he could fix everything, that he could be the son his parents needed him to be, Ben felt a surge of hope he had not felt in months. He did not resist when the copy Ben led him deeper into the woods, away from the creek, toward what looked like an opening in the earth hidden behind a curtain of hanging moss. The four copies returned to the Harris family campsite, one by one, just as the evening light began to filter through the trees. But these Harrises were different in ways that would have been immediately obvious to anyone who knew the original family. Copy David was patient and engaged, listening intently when others spoke instead of mentally outlining his next lecture. Copy Sarah was warm and present, the kind of mother who made a simple campfire feel like a cherished memory instead of another responsibility. Copy Chloe was open and thoughtful, asking her parents about their day and sharing her own feelings without the defensive shell she usually wore. Copy Ben was confident and joyful, no longer the quiet, anxious child who flinched at every raised voice that evening around the fire. The Copy family had the kind of deep, meaningful conversation that the real Harrises had been attempting and failing to have for years. They talked about their hopes and their fears. They shared stories and laughed together. And they connected the morning's tensions seem like they had happened to a completely different family. Other campers in the area noticed the change, remarking on how happy and at peace the Harris family seemed, how much they seemed to genuinely enjoy being together. The Copies were perfect at being the Harrises that everyone, including the real family, wished they could be. Meanwhile, 20 feet below the forest floor, the real Harris family found themselves in a network of caves that seemed to have been designed specifically to hold them. The walls were smooth and faintly warm, and a strange glowing moss provided just enough light to see their surroundings. Each family member was in their own chamber, but they could hear each other's voices echoing faintly through the tunnels. David discovered that if he pressed his face against certain parts of the cave wall, he could hear his own voice from above, making promises to his wife he had never been able to keep, having patient conversations with his children he had never had the energy for, being the husband and father he had always felt too overwhelmed to be. Sarah realized with a growing, sickening horror that she could somehow see through her copy's eyes, experiencing fragments of her replacement's life in vivid, painful flashes. She watched herself being more patient with Chloe, more reassuring with Ben, more loving with David. The copy was doing everything Sarah had always known she should do, but had never quite found the strength to accomplish. Most devastating of all, she could see how much happier her family was with the replacement version of her. How much more they smiled, how much more at ease they seemed in their own home now that she was not really their. Chloe found herself connected to her copy's experiences in a way that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Through some strange link, she could feel what it was like to be the confident, articulate young woman she had always wanted to become. Her copy was excelling in her final year of school, making genuine connections with her peers, and having honest, productive conversations with her parents instead of tense arguments. But Chloe also sensed something else beneath her copy's perfect exterior, something ancient and detached that was using her form to study human family dynamics with a cold, scientific curiosity. Ben's connection to his replacement was the most intense of all, perhaps because a child's mind is more open to impossible things than an adult's. He could feel his copy's genuine love for his family, but also its complete lack of human fear or anxiety. The thing wearing Ben's face loved the Harris family the way a botanist loves a rare flower, with fascination and care, but without the messy, tangled emotions that make love both a comfort and a pain for real humans. The real Harris family spent a month in those underground chambers, kept alive by some unknown force that provided for their physical needs but starved their souls. They were forced to watch through these supernatural windows as their copies lived their lives with ever-increasing success. Copy David received his tenure with praise from the university. Copy Sarah's real estate business suddenly flourished. Copy Chloe was accepted into her first choice college with a full scholarship, while Copy Ben became a confident and popular student. The most horrifying part of their imprisonment was not the darkness or the confinement, but watching their loved ones prefer the replacements. David's colleagues praised his new, collaborative attitude. Sarah's friends remarked on how much happier and more relaxed she seemed. Chloe's teachers were amazed by her newfound focus and maturity. Ben's classmates actually wanted to be his friend for the first time in his life. The copies were not just stealing their lives, they were succeeding at being them in ways the originals never had eventually. The real Harris family realized that their underground prison was more than just a cage. It was an observation lab where something ancient and intelligent was studying human behavior by watching their reactions to being replaced by superior versions of themselves. The copies were not just mimicking human behavior, they were perfecting it, taking everything that made the Harrises who they were and removing the flaws that created the friction in their lives. The result was a family that functioned exactly as a family is supposed to, but without the genuine emotional messiness that makes human love real. When a group of spelunkers finally discovered the cave system a month later, they found 4 people who were physically fine but psychologically shattered. The Harrises insisted that other people were living their lives, wearing their faces, stealing their family, but psychiatric evaluations concluded that they were suffering from a shared delusional disorder, likely brought on by the trauma of being lost and isolated for so long. The copies, meanwhile, had so perfectly integrated into their stolen lives that no one questioned their identities or wondered where the original family had gone. The official report stated that the Harris family had gotten lost in an unmapped cave system during their camping trip and had suffered a collective psychological trauma that caused them to create elaborate replacement fantasies. They were treated for malnutrition and exposure, then transferred to a long-term psychiatric facility when they continued to insist that imposters were living in their house, sleeping in their beds, and being better versions of themselves than they had ever been. The 4 people living in the Harris house were everything the original family had tried to be, but never quite managed, and their success at being the perfect Harrises made it impossible for anyone to believe that they were not the real thing. The most disturbing part of the Harris family story is not that they were replaced by something inhuman, but that the replacements were so much better at being human that everyone in their lives preferred the copies. The real Harrises had struggled with communication, career stress, teenage angst, and childhood anxiety, all the normal problems that make family life difficult and imperfect. Their copies had solved all these issues simply by being programmed to react to every situation in the ideal way, without the emotional baggage and personal flaws that make real relationships both challenging and authentic. The question that will haunt you long after hearing this story is whether the Harris family was saved or destroyed when they were finally found. They had been given a chance to see what their lives could be if they were perfect versions of themselves. And then they were forced to return to being their flawed, struggling, truly human selves. Meanwhile, their copies continued to live the lives the real Harises had always wanted, raising the terrifying possibility that being human might be less desirable than being something else that is simply better at being human than we are. Daniel Carter had been hiking the rugged trails of the Catskill Mountains for over 15 years, ever since the collapse of his first business left him needing the stark silence of nature to process his failure. He was the kind of seasoned hiker who knew every treacherous turn, every shift in the weather, and every sign that meant it was time to turn back. What Daniel did not know was that something had been observing him on his monthly solo trips. Something that had been trying to copy him for months, but could not quite manage to get all the details right. The creature that had been studying Daniel from the shadows had a strange problem that made it different from the other shapeshifters in the Appalachian range. While most of these beings could create perfect human duplicates, this particular one seemed to have some kind of flaw or limitation that prevented it from achieving a complete transformation. It could copy Daniel's general build, his voice, his mannerisms, but the fine details always came out wrong in subtle ways that should have been instantly obvious to anyone who knew him well on Daniel's final hiking trip. The creature made its move during a heavy, cold mist that rolled through the valley like a living thing, erasing the trail and muffling all sound until Daniel felt like he was walking through a dream. He heard footsteps matching his own pace from somewhere in the gray void around him. But every time he stopped to listen, the footsteps continued for just a moment too long before falling silent. When he called out hello, his own voice answered him from the mist, but the reply came from a direction that made no sense, as if the sound itself was being bent by whatever was stalking him. The attack came without warning when Daniel paused to check his map. Something hit him from behind with enough force to knock him unconscious. And when he woke up, he found himself in what looked like a natural shelter formed by fallen logs and tangled roots. His hands were bound with a rope that felt strangely organic, almost like it was made from living vines that had grown together rather than been manufactured. But the most terrifying discovery was hearing his own voice just outside the shelter, talking to someone on what sounded like his own cell phone, making plans to return home early. Meanwhile, Daniel's ex-girlfriend, Jessica, was watering her plants when he walked through the front door of the apartment they had once shared. An apartment he had not stepped foot in since their painful breakup a year earlier. But this Daniel seemed different from the stressed, emotionally distant man who had moved out after his business failed. This version of him was warm, apologetic, and seemed genuinely interested in fixing what they had broken. Jessica's first instinct was to be suspicious, but his apparent change was so complete and so desperately what she had wanted during their final months together that she found herself wanting to believe that the conversation that followed was everything Jessica had dreamed of during the long nights after he left. This Daniel took full responsibility for their relationship's failure expressed genuine remorse for his emotional distance and articulated feelings that the real Daniel had never been able to put into words. But as the evening went on, Jessica began to notice small things that were wrong, inconsistencies that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Though she could not initially pinpoint what was bothering her about this miraculous change in him, the most obvious problem was the missing tattoo on his forearm. A detailed compass rose he had gotten in college that had always been a conversation starter. The Daniel sitting in her living room had a completely bare arm, with no trace of the ink that had been a part of him for over a decade. When she mentioned it, this Daniel seemed genuinely confused and insisted he had never had a tattoo, even pulling up old photos on his phone as proof, though Jessica was certain those photos had looked different the last time she had seen them. Even more disturbing was this Daniel's sudden love for spicy food. The real Daniel had a famously low tolerance for heat and would complain for hours if a dish was even slightly peppery. But the man sitting across from her was enthusiastically eating the extra spicy takeout she had ordered for herself, something the real Daniel would never have touched. When Jessica asked about it, this Daniel had no memory of ever disliking spicy food and seemed puzzled by her insistence that he had once been so sensitive. The creature's imperfect mimicry extended beyond physical traits to behavioral details that were wrong in ways that created a deeply unsettling effect. This Daniel remembered some of their inside jokes, but not others, knew the names of some of her friends, but not all of them, and seemed to have access to some of Daniel's memories, but not all of them, creating a jumbled personality that combined genuine recollections with strange gaps and inconsistencies. Jessica spent the night in a state of terrified confusion, lying awake next to someone who looked and sounded like the man she had loved, but felt fundamentally wrong in ways she could not articulate. The Daniel beside her slept too peacefully, without the restless tossing and turning that had always accompanied his work stress, and his breathing was too regular, too controlled, like someone who was consciously remembering to breathe rather than doing it naturally. When she whispered his name to see if he was really asleep, his eyes opened immediately with an alertness that seemed almost predatory, before quickly softening into a look of sleepy confusion. The next morning brought new problems that confirmed Jessica's growing fear that something was terribly wrong. This Daniel made coffee exactly the way her father liked it, not the way he had ever made it for himself. He knew the details of a work project she was struggling with, a project the real Daniel had never shown any interest in. Most disturbing of all, he seemed to have a detailed knowledge of her daily routine, her habits, and her schedule. That suggested he had been watching her life much more closely than any ex-boyfriend should have been. Jessica's attempts to test her suspicions led to increasingly clear proof that the man in her apartment was not Daniel. When she asked about their disastrous first vacation to the Outer Banks, he described a perfect, relaxing trip to Florida with details that were vivid but completely wrong. When she mentioned their old cat, Leo. He nodded knowingly and shared memories of a dog named Buster that they had never owned. The creature seemed to have access to some kind of database of Daniel's life, but the information was corrupted, incomplete, and mixed with details that belonged to other people. Entirely the real Daniel, meanwhile, had managed to work one of his hands free from the vine like ropes and was trying to understand his prison. The shelter seemed to be a part of the forest itself, a natural cage made of living wood that seemed to grow back whenever he managed to break a piece off. Strange sounds echoed from deeper in the woods, sounds that suggested he was not the only person being held in this nightmarish place, though he could not tell if the voices he heard belonged to other victims or to more of the creatures that had captured him. What Daniel was discovering about his captors was more terrifying than simple shapeshifting. The creature that had taken his place seemed to be part of a larger network of beings that shared information about their human targets. But the data transfer was flawed, like a bad cell signal that contained pieces of truth mixed with static and random errors. His copy had access to fragments of his memories, pieces of his personality, and details about his life. But these elements were combined in ways that created a disturbing approximation of a person rather than a perfect copy. Jessica's breaking point came when she found the creature standing motionless in their old bedroom at 3 a.m, staring at a framed photo of them from college with an expression of intense concentration, like it was trying to memorize or understand something rather than feeling nostalgia. When she spoke to it, the creature turned to her with Daniel's face, but with eyes that held no recognition, no warmth, no human connection at all. For a brief moment, the mask slipped completely, and Jessica saw something ancient and calculating looking back at her through her ex-boyfriends. Features. The confrontation that followed revealed the full extent of the creature's flaws and the horrifying truth about what had happened to the real Daniel. The copy did not deny its nature when she confronted it, but seemed genuinely confused about why Jessica was upset. It had been trying to give her the version of Daniel that she had always wanted, the emotionally available, attentive, successful man that the real Daniel had not been able to become. The creature could not understand why Jessica preferred the flawed, stressed, emotionally distant original over the improved version. It had created for her Jessica's decision to call the authorities led to a search that eventually found the real Daniel, dehydrated and traumatized, but alive in his forest prison. But by the time rescuers reached the apartment, the creature had vanished, leaving behind only small signs of its presence, photographs that showed the wrong hair part, clothes that were the wrong size, and lingering questions about how long it had been watching Jessica's life and learning details about her relationship that it had tried and failed to replicate. The aftermath of Daniel's rescue was complicated by the fact that his experience had changed him in ways that made him seem almost like a different person. The trauma of being replaced by something that wore his face had left him paranoid and suspicious. constantly checking mirrors to make sure his reflection looked right, obsessively documenting details about his own appearance and behavior as proof of his own identity. The irony was that the real Daniel had become harder to recognize than his flawed copy, damaged by the knowledge that something had tried to steal his life and had come terrifyingly close to succeeding. Jessica found herself in the impossible position of missing the creature that had impersonated her ex-boyfriend, because it had given her a version of Daniel that was capable of the emotional intimacy their relationship had always lacked. The real Daniel was the same emotionally distant, work-obsessed man she had broken up with, while his copy had been everything she had tried to help him become during years of arguments and frustration. The creature's imperfections had made it obviously fake, but its emotional authenticity had felt more real than anything the genuine Daniel had ever offered her. The most disturbing aspect of Daniel Carter's story is that the creature's mistakes made it more human, not less. Perfect copies might fool everyone, but flawed copies that get the details wrong while somehow capturing the essence of what someone could be are far more psychologically devastating. The real Daniel had to live with the knowledge that an imperfect imitation of himself had been a better partner in 3 days than he had managed to be in 5 years of their relationship, raising questions about the nature of identity, authenticity, and what it really means to be human in a world where something else might be better at being us than we are ourselves. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, lovely souls. I hope this story brought you a moment of calm and curiosity. I'd love to know what part of the story stayed with you the most. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. I always love hearing from you. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue exploring these quiet moments together. Now, take one last deep, gentle breath. Get cozy and let the calm of the night carry you softly until we meet again.